Wednesday. I hope this finds everyone doing well. We will be talking about the 1920s today, the new era, as it's called. I suggest you take notes over the lecture today. Now, in March of 1921, Warren G. Harding became the 29th President of the United States. He won with a landslide election with a promise of a return to normalcy. Now, he even stated in his inauguration speech, "Our supreme task is the resumption of our onward normal way." Now, the normalcy he was referring to was longed for by the people. After the Great War, racial violence, political repression, and the Red Scare with the Bolshevik Revolution, people were afraid of communism. Also, there were all the deaths from the Great War and the flu epidemic of 1918. And the United States at that point was in a tanked economy with a 20% unemployment rate. Now, Harding's presidency would actually go down as the most corrupt for scandals. Several of Harding's cabinet appointees were actually individuals qualified with true stature for the job. Henry C. Wallace was Secretary of Agriculture. Herbert Hoover was Secretary of Commerce. But mostly Harding had appointed friends, close supporters, and they were actually dubbed the Ohio Gang. Now, this led to the trouble which plagued Harding throughout his administration. The Teapot Dome scandal, which was named so because of a rock formation nearby that looked like a teapot, was when several officials conspired to lease government land in Wyoming to oil companies in exchange for cash. Now, this led to his Interior Secretary, Albert Ball, and the Navy Secretary, Edwin Denby, to be convicted and eventually sent to jail. Now, in August of 1923, while on vacation, Harding died suddenly of a heart attack, and Vice President Calvin Coolidge became the 30th President of the United States. Let's talk about immigration now. In the 1920s was a difficult time for immigrants. There was a fear of foreign radicals, and it actually led to the execution of two men, Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti. These were two Italian men. In May of 1920, they had been arrested for robbery and murder connected with an incident at a Massachusetts factory. Now, their guilty verdicts were appealed for years as evidence surrounding their conviction was slim. For instance, you had eyewitnesses who were swearing that the getaway driver was Vanzetti, while other witnesses were describing somebody different altogether. Nevertheless, despite worldwide lobbying by radicals and by a respectable movement by middle-class Italian organizations in the United States, the two men were executed on August 23, 1927. Now, Vanzetti conceivably provided the most succinct reason for his death, saying, "This is what I say. I am suffering because I'm a radical, and indeed I am a radical. I have suffered because I was an Italian, and indeed I am an Italian." So he was basically saying that I am being executed because I'm a radical and I'm an Italian, not because I did anything wrong. Now, the Sacco and Vanzetti case demonstrated a predisposition among native-born Americans, and when I say that, I'm talking about Caucasian Americans, to see immigrants as a threat to the safety and security of the American people. Now, after the Great War, Americans were suspicious of foreigners, and in 1921, Congress passed the National Origins Act, which was designed to limit the number of Southern and Eastern European immigrants. Now, I'm going to talk about some of the amendments, or some of the laws passed in the 1920s, or close to the 1920s. In January of 1919, the 18th Amendment was ratified, which was prohibition. Now, prohibition prohibited the sale and manufacture of alcohol. You will see that repealed a few amendments later. The 19th Amendment, which was known as women's suffrage, gave women the right to vote in August of 1920, and this was after a century of protests. Now, this amendment would actually lead to another amendment introduced into Congress in 1923 calling for the elimination of all legal distinctions on account of sex, but was defeated in Congress, and this amendment was known as the Equal Rights Amendment, or the ERA. In the 1920s, you're going to see a culture of consumption and a culture of escapism. Now, with the discovery of new manufacturing technologies, the market was flooded with a range of consumer products, such as ready-to-wear clothes, convenience foods, home appliances. Department stores started popping up, emporiums, and then you were seeing services within these department stores that were marketed toward the majority of consumers during that day who were women. You would see restaurants opening up, babysitting services, etc. Now, in the 1920s, magazines started being sold with advertisements. You started seeing mail order catalogs. The automobile industry also fostered the new culture of consumption by promoting the use of credit. By 1927, more than 60% of American automobiles were sold on credit in installment purchasing plans, which was made available for a large amount of consumers. Now the middle class could now afford automobiles, and their ability to procure an automobile actually impacted the day-to-day life in the United States of the middle class. And the middle class was actually the backbone of the consumer revolution in the 1920s. In the 1920s, you're also going to see the innovation of film, which just mesmerized Americans and gave them their need or want of escape while going to the movies. The Jazz Singer was the first movie with synchronized words and pictures. The influences of actresses during that time, such as Mary Pickford, revolutionized the glamorous flapper look. Now, during the 1920s, women who wore short skirts and makeup and enjoyed smoking, drinking, and dancing were known as flappers. There were innovations in music with jazz. Soap operas made their way onto radio. You see the immersion of amusement parks, such as Coney Island in New York. There were aviation advances with Lindbergh flying over the Atlantic, and professional sports teams were born. And they became popular with the emergence of sports figures such as Babe Ruth. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the Scopes trial. In March of 1925, in a tiny courtroom in Dayton, Tennessee, fundamentalists gathered to tackle the issues of creation and evolution. Now, the Scopes trial, also known as the monkey trial, was brought about by a young biology teacher named John T. Scopes. Now, he was being tried for teaching his students the evolutionary theory of Charles Darwin. And this was in violation of the Butler Act of Tennessee. And the Butler Act prevented any educator from teaching evolutionary theory or any theory that denied the divine creation of man as taught by the Bible in any publicly funded Tennessee classroom. Now, seeing the act as a threat to a personal liberty, the ACLU became involved, which is the American Civil Liberties Union. And they had been looking for and seeking out a test case, which they were hoping, win or lose, they could keep appealing and maybe get their day in the Supreme Court, so then they could so they could have their day in court and hope that they could question the constitutionality of allowing or not allowing evolutionary teaching within a classroom. Now, Scopes' violation of the law was never in question. He admitted to violating the law. So the stage was set for a pivotal courtroom showdown. It was considered the trial of the century at that point between the champions and opponents of evolution, and it marked a key moment in an enduring American culture war. Now, the case actually became a public spectacle. Clarence Darrow, an agnostic attorney, and an agnostic just means that he doesn't believe either way that there's a God, whatever is. And he was an attorney and a keen liberal mind from Chicago. He volunteered to aid the defense and came up against William Jennings Bryan. Now, Bryan was the great commoner. He was a presidential candidate 3 times in his younger days, and he led a political crusade against corporate greed. He defended biblical literalism in similar terms. The theory of evolution, Bryan said, with its emphasis on the survival of the fittest, would eliminate love and carry man back to the struggle of tooth and claw. Now, newspapermen and spectators flooded the courtroom in the town of Dayton. Across the nation, Americans turned to their radios and national broadcasts of the trial. It dealt with the questions of religious liberty, academic freedom, parental rights, and the moral responsibility of education. Now, the trial lasted 6 days in July, and the men and women of America were captivated as Bryan presented his argument on the morally corrupting influence of evolutionary theory, while Darrow eloquently fought for academic freedom. Bryan took the stand himself as an expert witness of the Bible, but he was no match for Darrow's famous skills as a trial lawyer. Now, Sculp's guilt being established, the jury delivered a guilty verdict within minutes of the trial's conclusion. The case was later thrown out on a technicality. Now, each side considered themselves being victorious, and the Scopes trial was a perfect reflection of the culture wars of the 1920s because it focused on the negative impact of immigration on American society, which resulted in a guilty verdict and its subsequent overturning, leaving both sides feeling vindicated. Okay, now we're going to go on to African Americans in the 1920s. Now, just as cultural limits loosened across the nation, the 1920s represented a period of serious self-reflection among African Americans, most especially those in northern ghettos. Now, New York City was a popular destination of African Americans during the Great Migration. The city's black population grew 257% from around 92,000 in 1910 to roughly 328,000 by 1930. The white population only grew by 20% during that time period, and nearly half of those African Americans made their home in Manhattan's Harlem district. Now, this set up that district for the Harlem Renaissance, which was born during this time and manifested in theater, art, and music. There were other figures during this time, such as Marcus Garvey. Now, he was a radical African-American leader, and his organization, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, promoted the Back to Africa movement, which sought to move Black Americans to their ancestral homelands. Now, with the population of African Americans growing, the Ku Klux Klan also emerged in the South in the 1920s. The organization's adoption of nativist and traditional views attributed to the spread of white supremacy ideology. Now, we're going to wrap that up for the end of the 1920s era, and we are going to come back next week and start talking about the Great Depression. And after we have the Great Depression, we're going to start moving into World War II, and the things that are going to lead up to us getting into another world war. I hope y'all all have a great week, and I will see you next week.